Welcome to the Next Level Human podcast. As a human, you have a job to do. In fact, you have 4 jobs: to earn and manage money, to attain and maintain health and fitness, to build and sustain personal relationships, to find meaning and make a difference. None of these jobs are taught in school, and that is what this podcast is designed to do. To educate us all on living our most fulfilled lives through the mastery of these 4 jobs. I'm your host, Dr. Jade, Teta, and I believe we are here living this life for 3 reasons and 3 reasons only: to learn, to teach, and to love. In this podcast, I will be learning, teaching, and loving right along with you. I'm grateful to have your company. Here's to our next level. All right, welcome to the show, everyone. I have a treat for you today, Dr. Mary Kellis, another clinician on the show. And we were just talking briefly before we jumped on. I love having real clinicians, people who have real world experience working with patients and clients on the show, because there's, in my mind, there's sort of 3 different types of experts, right? There's the role model expert, there's sort of the PhD researcher type, and then there's the results getter clinician, the person that sees people on the ground. And so I'm really excited you're here, Dr. Kellis. We're going to be talking about one of the most important topics, I think, in medicine. We're going to be talking diabetes, blood sugar, things like metabolic syndrome, all this stuff about how our bodies deal with and handle sugar and the diseases that are spawned from that. And you are the perfect person to do this because you are an endocrinologist. So in case people don't know what that means, someone who studies the hormones in the body, and in this case, specialty in dealing with hormones like insulin and cortisol and all these hormones that impact blood sugar regulation and more. So thank you so much for being here. We're blessed to have you on the show and your time. Why don't you get us started by giving us a little bit of background on you, anything you want us to know about you, and also how you got into this work, and sort of what you think the state of the industry is, and just wherever you want to start would be wonderful.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I am really excited to be here today with you. A little bit about my background. I'm actually a native of New York City, born and bred there. I thought I would end up there my whole life because that's what New Yorkers think. But yeah. I met my husband on vacation in Greece, and here I am in Cleveland, Ohio. And I currently am a clinical endocrinologist at the Cleveland Clinic, seeing multiple patients for various different endocrine disorders. I see a lot of diabetes, and there are type 1, type 2, pre-diabetes, people with metabolic syndrome. And it's one of my passions. It's a disease that can have multiple complications, and getting the word out there early and trying to prevent those complications is one of the things I'm most passionate about. I'm also a medical advisor at Sugar Break, which is a company that has 3 products to help people who have blood sugar issues. And that also has been very positive in making a difference in people who have these conditions.
Yeah. Well, so I don't know. We have something in common. My family's from the Manhattan area, and I actually did, before I went to medical school, I volunteered at Lincoln Hospital in the Bronx.
Oh my God! You have a little bit of an accent, but maybe it's not a New York accent. But I could have sworn maybe I picked something up there.
Well, you know what it is. It's funny. It's because I grew up in the South with Northern parents, so from the Manhattan area. And
okay.
So people go, it's a little bit South, it's a little bit North, and it's a little bit hip hop. I don't know, what that is, but it's a unique accent. But anyway, I loved my time there, and so we definitely share that. And I will be in the city in actually about 2 weeks, so I'll be heading up there. I know it's different right now with the whole COVID thing going on.
Oh yeah, my whole family is still out there, and it's definitely different, but the vibe is back. The buzz is back. So it's not dead anymore.
Yeah, that's what I heard. And it's been several years since I've been there. But, so let's get into this, because I know that it's sort of a misunderstood thing when people really sort of get into this. The one of the things I love about you, so I'm a naturopathic physician, right? So I came from the natural medicine world and I get some conventional training. You're a conventional doctor who also has gone into the natural world. And I love this, right? Because we come at this from two different sides, but we kind of oftentimes end up in the middle, clinicians like you and me. And so it's really interesting because I can tell you're really taking this sort of approach that has both the best of conventional and alternative natural sort of therapies. And I do think this is the clinician of the future. So you and I, in a sense, are sort of early adopters in this. Help us understand how this works, because we're going to have two types of people, right, who are listening to you and I right now. We're going to have the natural medicine only type of people, right, who are just like, I don't want to do anything but, natural supplements and things like that, and diet and exercise. And then we're going to have the people who are sort of more sort of conventionally minded and kind of go, what's wrong with drugs? I myself, I have Hashimoto's thyroiditis. I am on thyroid medications. There's a time and a place for these things. So why don't you help us sort of understand how we should be thinking about blood sugar management and the sort of chasm between when it's time to sort of go into the conventional world and how powerful is the natural medicine world in terms of diet and exercise? What have you seen in the clinic in terms of these treatment options? And I think it's just be a nice discussion for us to give everyone sort of an understanding of how a clinician is looking at this stuff, from sort of early diagnosis to potential blood sugar issues, prediabetes, diabetes, and then treatment options.
So great questions. I mean, I think initially when someone is pre-diabetic, there's so much they can try to do to kind of make things better before they transition over to having diabetes. Like, for example, these lifestyle changes that we talk about, exercising and the types of exercising, and resistance and strength training and all of these things, and also reducing carbohydrates and making those lifestyle changes. But when you do all that you can and genetics is up against you, and or you have other issues like obesity that can contribute to this insulin resistance, then sometimes you have to take the next step. So, the wonderful thing about the way how diabetes has been changing over time in the management of diabetes, if you look back, back in the 80s, we didn't have many oral options for diabetes in terms of pharma. We had the sulfonylureas, which are the drugs like glyburide, for example, that can help reduce blood sugar by telling the pancreas to release insulin. And then in the 90s, we got metformin, which is a drug that many people start out with first line when they're diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. That makes you more insulin sensitive, and it inhibits something called gluconeogenesis, so the body's ability to be making more glucose. And, for many years, our options were limited. And then 2000 comes around and we start getting all these wonderful different types of drugs that can affect basically different parts of the physiology of diabetes, which together work to really improve blood sugar in various ways. So, for example, the DPP-4 inhibitors, a class of drugs that basically will help to increase a hormone that's very important called GLP-1, which is an incretin. And we know in type 2 diabetes that hormone is reduced. So this medication actually inhibits its breakdown, so more of that is around. So this hormone is quite important because it makes you more insulin sensitive. And, as a result, from there, we've also had different drugs like the GLP-1 hormone itself that's been out also in weekly form and even daily form, and now oral form. And this not only helps bringing down the blood sugar, but is actually also helping with weight loss. So, the SGLT2 inhibitors is a completely other group of drugs that help to target the kidney. So at the level of the kidney, it helps inhibit makes glucose be released in the urine. So as a result, you improve the blood sugar and you can have weight loss, and it can also help your blood pressure as well as your blood sugar. And actually, a lot of the data with those class of drugs have actually been found to reduce the cardiovascular mortality and morbidity in people with diabetes. So these newer generation drugs don't just target blood sugar, but they also target cardiac and help to improve associated complications with diabetes. So the SGLT2 inhibitors, like we discussed, they also can help with kidney function and decreasing protein loss in the urine. So it's nice to know that we have all these different combinations that are available to help improve blood sugar. For years and years, though, we've had supplements and actually leaves and extracts and, all these other things that came before these oral medications that people use to try and bring blood sugar down. Like, for example, the white mulberry leaf extract, cinnamon, for example, banaba leaf extract, gymnema. So all these other things that we've had in nature that we've learned have helped to bring blood sugar down. But because they've been from years and years before we had the science and the research and the randomized clinical trials, we never really got to that point where we had all this data to suggest its benefit. So the really cool thing about living in our era is that we have this beautiful symbiosis where people are now saying, I want more natural, but they know they need pharma. And there may be this ability to use both, for example. And now there's a lot more data and clinical studies being done on some of these, natural or supplemental products that have helped to show this improvement in blood sugar.
I love the way you tie this all together, and it's kind of fascinating stuff, right? For those of you sort of following this discussion, if you take GLP-1 for example, there are many different things that release this naturally. What essentially these new drugs are doing is essentially taking advantage of this in a bigger way. Sometimes some of the natural agents, and of course, Dr. Kellis and I both are fans of natural medicine, but when you get into the clinic, you oftentimes see that why they can be powerful in some people, in other people, they're not as powerful. And you do need to bring in some of these pharmaceuticals. It's interesting, the just a little bit of the history on this, and maybe a little bit about this as well. But one of the things that I was fascinated by is when early on when they were looking at doing essentially the stomach reduction, where they're essentially bypassing certain aspects of the small intestines and amplifying GLP-1 because it's kind of farther down in the digestive tract, and kind of seeing some of these people who underwent these surgeries reversing diabetes very, very quickly. And this spawned, to my understanding, this whole sort of understanding about what happens with the GIP-GLP-1 sort of ratio. And so essentially, for those of you listening, and I know we have a lot of people, and I told Dr. Kellis this when she jumped on, a lot of you are very savvy and sort of understand this conversation. But one of the things I think is exciting about you is that oftentimes those people who are excited about natural medicine don't always want to talk about the pharmaceuticals because they see them as dangerous, or they see them as bad. And I'm just making the case here to show that these are natural things that these pharmaceuticals are working against. And of course, there are downsides to all of this, but I love the idea of walking people through when is the natural medicine appropriate and when are these other things appropriate based on, things that the metabolism is actually doing. If we can amplify GLP-1 signaling in some way, this has benefits. By the way, you can do this with things like coffee. You can do this by changing the protein carbohydrate ratio. There are other things to do it. They just don't do it perhaps as powerful. So why don't we go through a little bit more of this? Let's just walk them through the way you and I, and especially you, might be looking at this clinically. So let's say someone comes into you and they are starting to have blood sugar related issues. How would you tell that? So let's say, what would you start seeing on the fasting blood sugar? What might you be seeing clinically in terms of signs and symptoms that you might be saying, we need to kind of look a little bit further what's going on with their blood sugar handling? And then let's sort of talk about some of the treatments, including diet and natural stuff you might do before getting to the pharmaceuticals.
So, I mean, a lot of times on a fasting glucose, if you're, hitting over 100, then you do have some impaired fasting blood sugar. If you have more than 126, by definition, if that's repeated times 2, it's considered diabetes. And then the A1C, which is the average blood sugar over a 3-month period of time, anything above 6.5 is considered diabetes. And if you're between 5.7 and 6.4, you're considered pre-diabetic. So when you start seeing this, what's called impaired fasting glucose, so not quite diabetes, but in between, there are things that you can try to help reduce that. And again, a lot of times you have to, you always look at the patient, and every patient is different. Every patient has different circumstances. Some patients are obese, and again, that increases the insulin resistance, which can make it harder for you to achieve, normal blood glucose. Weight loss is very important in that patient, and weight loss can help with that. Building muscles can help that because it makes you more insulin sensitive. So every patient takes, we take a different approach based on who they are, what their risk factors are. But you always emphasize, again, the lifestyle changes that you need to make, the healthy choices. And, the one interesting thing that I like to tell people who have diabetes is that I tell non-diabetics the same as I would tell someone who has diabetes, how to eat healthy. I mean, it's not that you have diabetes and now you have to eat something completely different. We all need to watch our carbohydrates. We might not have diabetes, we might not have prediabetes, but we all have to be healthy and reducing those refined sugars. So, it's the approach also of how you talk to the patient, and, build that trust to have that relationship to help them make that change so we can see improvements in the lifestyle, for example. And if we don't get it by lifestyle, diet and exercise, then sometimes we do need to add, additional medication. So, for example, as I said earlier, metformin would be the first choice from pharma. Sometimes people don't want to do metformin. So then, sometimes they'll do, cinnamon or cinnamon supplements or, stabilize, where, we have these multiple supplements within there, different leaf extracts that chromium that have been shown to reduce blood sugar. So it really depends on the patient and their approach and how they want to best approach it. As I like to approach it as a team, because obviously that's the best way to make change. You can't enforce a certain thing. You need to have that patient with you in conversation, have that trust relationship, and see how what their goals are. And if they do want a more natural way, we would try that before we, go on to more pharmaceuticals. But again, once you hit a certain point, you most often, if the natural way, the lifestyle is not working, you probably move into, needing to use some of these drugs, these great drugs that are out there, to help reduce blood sugar and improve weight and potentially have improvement in cardiovascular risk as well.
Yeah, I definitely want to talk about those drugs a little bit more. One of the things I'm curious, and I just want to repeat a couple things you said here, just because I know people, these are very important things for us to know, especially those of you who are looking after your own health. And I'll just repeat this, Dr. Kellis, and just catch me if I make any mistakes here, just so we can give the listener some clear guidelines. So what I'm hearing you say is that for those of you who are looking at this, once your blood sugars are generally tracking up, fasting above 100, this is where Dr. Kellis is essentially saying this is where you're starting to approach prediabetes. Now, there's a big gap between 100 and 126, but when we diagnose, it's essentially 126 on 2 separate fasting occasions. This is the definition of diabetes. And this is when you would be diagnosed with type 2 diabetes from our perspective. Now, also, we have another measure called hemoglobin A1C that basically tells you the average of blood sugar readings over about a 3-month period. And so Dr. Kellis here is telling us once this gets about 6.5, this is diagnostic. typically we look at, and correct me if I'm wrong here, Dr. Kellis, but I like to see it below 5.5 optimally. And so you're in that gray zone between 5.5 and 6.5. So if you're one of these people who's looking at, you're in the hundreds, not quite 126 on fasting blood sugars, and your hemoglobin A1C is above 5.5, not quite up to 6.5, we're starting to look at you as being pre-diabetic. And then at that point, Dr. Kellis is talking about, we're going to start to make some diet and lifestyle recommendations right there. And so let's go through some of these, because I know people are going to say, a lot of people have a lot of opinions about these things. So diet wise, where would you start? I mean, we have the paleo diet, we have the keto diet, we just have reduction of carbohydrates there. We have people who talk about intermittent fasting. And I'll just say briefly, I've seen all of these approaches do well for people based on what they can maintain. I've also seen these not do so well for some people because they cannot maintain it or because of other mechanisms. For example, stress hormones can also make insulin resistant. They also can cause cravings and make it more difficult for you to stay on a diet. So I'm curious, from your perspective, with your clinical sort of, experience, where do you start with this? Is it simply, hey, I want you not to go above a certain amount of total carbohydrates? Are you someone who likes the keto diet, paleo diet? What is your natural sort of first step here from the diet perspective?
So my natural first step is not to call it diet, because as soon as you call it diet, everything goes out the window. So it's a lifestyle change. And it's, the way I see it is weight gain is a fascinating topic, and it's probably should be a topic on another podcast. But the multiple different factors that go into weight beyond what goes in and exercise, microbiome, stressors, all these different things, hormones that play a role into why people gain weight. It's an interesting, fascinating topic that we definitely should do at a later date. But basically, in terms of what I tell them, it really depends on the person, because there are some people who they get into a keto diet, they do amazing. They'll lose 50 pounds, 60 pounds, and they're sticking to it. But as soon as those carbs start coming back, it's all regained. So this is why I don't like to say this diet works, that diet works. But, I sort of see what you take in and food and telling people about how to eat similar to exercise. Like when a patient tells me, I'm working out like an hour a day for 5 days a week and I'm not losing weight. And I'm like, change the exercise. Your body is used to it. You need to do something different to jumpstart your metabolism and get it going again. So I think if you do something chronically, after a while, and as we know about, weight loss, ultimately you drop, and then you plateau, and patients get upset when they plateau, and then they start finding things to put back in their mouth and the weight goes back on. So, I do think, that having, when you do have prediabetes or diabetes, you do have to be more conscientious about the carbs and reducing carbs. That also can help with, weight loss, and the type of carbs, like, obviously avoiding refined sugars, the white breads, the white pastas, that kind of stuff. You want to eat a lot less of, if eliminate completely. So those are the things that you should probably, be avoiding. But I actually do really like the intermittent fasting. I think, for some people, and there is some data to support it, and then there's some data to refute it. You'll always find science to back and science to, refute. But what I like about it is that a lot of people stress eat. And so if you tell yourself, I can't eat between this time and that time, those night eaters, it could be potentially useful for them, because if they know they need to stop at 6:30 p.m. and they're kind of restricting themselves to that time period, then those additional 2,000 calories that come in after dinner won't come in. So, again, it's very variable. And I don't think I have like a prescription for the general public. I think every patient is different. And that's why clinical medicine is so cool, right? Because, you get to see all these people and, work with them and treat them individually, which is how they should be treated.
Yeah, it's funny. I'll tell you a funny story, Dr. Kellis. You'll appreciate this. But when I was very early on in clinical practice, I had this long haul trucker come in. His wife sent him in. I just remember him by Dale, not his real name, because we don't use real names. But I wrote about him in one of my books. And it was funny because he was just like, I don't know why I'm here, but he was, basically early diagnosed. He was on metformin. He was 30 to 40 pounds overweight. I was taking his lifestyle, and this guy ate at Greasy Spoons, fast food places. He basically ate where his truck went. And he was a good old boy in a sense from the South. So, he wasn't going to switch to eating, wild caught salmon and organic kale. And at that time, essentially what I did is just say, listen, can we get you off the sodas and instead do Diet Coke? Now, at that time, Diet Coke was considered, in my mind, poison. I just was like, it's not as poison as, the actual sugar you're putting in your body. Can we strip the buns off of your burgers? Can we get you to, eat nuts instead of chips when you're at the ExxonMobil station getting a snack? And, he looked at me kind of strange and said, I can do that. And that's really all I wanted to hear. Is that he could get these things out, eat at all the same places, but eat differently. And, I never thought I'd see him again. He turned about 3-4 months later. I did not recognize him. He was no longer diabetic. I was doing a consulting clinic at the time, so I wasn't managing his meds. His doctor took him off the metformin. Wow. And this was something that was one of these cases that I would never forget, because at that time in my clinical practice, I never would have dreamed of telling someone to eat diet soda or any of these kinds of things. But what it was, it spoke to what you just said, is that you have to meet your clients, patients, where they are. And if you're listening to this and you're not in the health coaching field or a clinician or something like that, then you also have to figure out and find what works for you. And isn't it amazing that we have someone like Dr. Kellis, who's, probably seen thousands of patients, myself as well. And her sort of recommendation is find and do what works for you, right? And that's essentially, I think, what clinical medicine does. You see all these different people and you find out very quickly that one approach that works fantastic for one person just explodes and works not at all in another person. And you have to really work to figure this out. But it's just, I kind of guessed that was going to be your answer, but it always blows my mind whenever you're talking to a clinician. This is almost always the case because they work with so many people. I'm sorry to break into the show, but I wanted to take a second to cover one of our sponsors and tell you all about Paleo Valley at paleovalley.com. These are the grass-fed sticks that I tell you all so much about, that all of my friends know I have on hand constantly. They are in my car. They are at my house. I keep them at my sister's home and my parents' house. I have these things everywhere because they are the simplest, most convenient whole foods protein supplement you can get. Almost like carrying around pure protein, low carb protein in your pocket. They also, these Paleo Valley beef sticks are the only 100% grass-fed and grass-finished beef sticks on the market. They use organic spices. They are naturally fermented instead of using nitrates and nitrites that can be a problem in some of these cured meats. And they simply taste fantastic. Check out the original or the jalapeno. Those are my favorites. Please make sure you go over to paleovalley.com and visit. When checking out, use the code NEXTLEVEL for a 15% discount. Remember, our sponsors keep the show going by you giving them your patronage and spending your money on these high quality products. You actually do a few things. One, you're helping to support the podcast. And two, you are helping your health. And three, you are making sure that good quality companies like Paleo Valley can be out there doing their business, changing the world, making the earth better. One of the things you may not know about this is that grass-fed organic and grass-finished beef is doing something that is so utterly important for our environment, actually helping to repopulate the topsoil. A lot of people don't know this, but our topsoil is being extremely depleted. And raising animals, especially cattle, the correct way helps to get that topsoil back. This is one of the reasons why I love Paleo Valley. Not to mention it tastes fantastic, but they're one of these companies, like my other sponsors, Cured Nutrition and Organifi, that are doing the right things by the environment. I really appreciate everything they do, and I hope you will check them out. Thanks so much. PaleoValley.com. Use the code NEXTLEVEL. And now back to the show. It is time to talk about one of our sponsors, our earliest sponsor, Cured Nutrition. This is a CBD company. Cured Nutrition is another one of those next level human companies that is doing amazing things in the world. Let me tell you a little bit about one of the things I've been doing with CBD here recently. There is some really interesting research showing that chronic cannabis users, these are people who are smoking marijuana, are actually down-regulating the cannabinoid 1 receptor. Well, guess what the cannabinoid 1 receptor is involved in? Well, it's involved in cravings and hunger. And there is some really interesting mouse research that shows mice given products that lower CB1 or being engineered with a lower CB1 activity actually eat less and are not obese as a result of that. And so I have been experimenting using CBD to lower hunger, to down-regulate the CB1 receptor, just the way chronic cannabis users tend to be very thin. And it has been working very well. Now, of course, the other thing that I use this for and have used it for since day one is Cured Nutrition has a product called Zen that is a mix of magnesium and CBD and some other really nice formulations in there that I use to help me sleep. I have notoriously bad sleep. My sleep still is not perfect, but the Cured Nutrition product Zen has made a big difference to helping me sleep better. And that is just huge. Now, of course, they have other products. They also have a product called Rise, which I do not use, but I have used in the past. It is great for those people who like to have a pick-me-up in the morning to focus better. So Zen and Rise are fantastic, but any of their CBD products used for downregulation of the CB1 receptor to help with hunger and cravings, if you're one of these people who is constantly overeating and on a diet, you find that, hey, when I'm on a diet, I get this crazy sort of hunger and cravings. This may be something you want to check out. So check out curednutrition.com, use the code NEXTLEVEL. I get a kickback to help us have these discussions on the show. It's a great way for me to be able to do this work. So thank you for Cured Nutrition for that. Of course, Cured Nutrition gets the sale, and you get to work with a fantastic company that gets results with their supplements. I hope you will check them out, curednutrition.com. Use the code NEXTLEVEL. And now let's go ahead and get back to the show. Let's do it.
Yeah. And honestly, I think, for those who, for example, are listening to this and have diabetes, it's really important to find a provider, a doctor who takes care of you, that you understand, that listens to you and trusts you and can work with you. If you don't like their philosophy, or if you feel like they're just telling you what to do, that might not be the right doctor for you. I mean, you need to voice your concerns, tell them how you see it and how you would like it. And of course, as a doctor, we are guiding the best we can to improve your health as best as we can. But it's always important to know from their end where they're coming from too, because honestly, if sometimes, a patient will say, yeah, I'll take it. And then they go home and they don't take it, and it's because they're afraid, they don't know what the side effects are, this and that. So, building that trust and really having the faith and in your physician is really, really important. I mean, that is definitely the first step in helping to get you to where you need to be in terms of your diabetes goals.
Yeah, 100% agree on that. So diet, I think, we kind of discussed, both of us, sort of would agree. It's really finding what works for you. I think getting the carbohydrates out. One thing I'll ask you about is one of the things I have seen, and I want to see if you've seen this as well, is especially when I'm working with, people who are, been diabetic for a while and morbidly obese. One of the things that I think that I have seen in my clinical practice is sometimes, obviously, the first move is always pulling out carbohydrates. Sometimes you see protein having a negative effect on blood sugars as well. And sometimes you have to tick up the fat content of the diet to control this if you're working on diet. Do you see that as well? And do you see it? I see it usually only in, people who are, basically uncontrolled diabetics, that you really have to, sometimes that protein can drive gluconeogenesis. And so I do sometimes move more towards, a higher fat, lower carb, moderate protein diet, which looks a lot like the keto diet. I just rarely jump to that right off the bat.
Yeah. And, the interesting thing is sometimes I just had a patient the other day who was like, oh, I eat very low carb. And she was telling me, I don't understand, like my meal had no carbs in it, but my blood sugar went skyrocketing. And it's true. I mean, you obviously do count the carbohydrates, but sometimes the protein in the meal and the way that things are absorbed, you can sometimes see those excursions in the blood sugars. So yeah.
What is your thought about now we have, like, I'm wearing a levels device right now, right? And so a lot of us have these CGMs that we're sort of wearing, and they're relatively new to clinical practice. I've had not nearly enough experience just because they haven't been out long enough, but I've been seeing some very interesting things with this. For example, I've seen some the clients that I've been working with, tapioca starch, for example. I've seen for some people that's in a lot of these low calorie, low sugar items that aren't supposed to spike blood sugars. And I've seen that some of this you're seeing it does not impact their blood sugar that much. And in others, you're seeing it really drive blood sugars up. And this is a really unique tool now, because now we can not just say, hey, you should be reducing your carbohydrates, but now we can also be seeing that, like they showed in the PREDICT study, that essentially certain individuals eating the exact same foods having vastly different, glucose excursions, which is great for clinicians like us. And I'm just wondering how you're using that, and if you have enough experience yet to draw any kind of conclusions around that.
Certainly do. I think the continuous glucose monitors are amazing. They are, like, I got the chills just saying it, for real. I mean, it's made a huge difference for so many people. I had a type 1 diabetic. She's had diabetes, patient with diabetes I want to be politically correct here. She's had diabetes for 50 plus years, and her A1C was always in the 9s because she was so petrified of hypoglycemia, low blood sugar.
Yeah.
Every time I corrected how much she would need to take before meals, she never gave it to herself. She was too afraid to go low. And, honestly, it is one of the rewards of this job. I think, having her started on this, she feels more comfortable. She has the alarms that'll let her know when she's dropping. So she's taking more of that insulin before the meal, and her A1C is now normal. She's not getting hypoglycemia. You look at the CGM tracing and it's like a straight line across. I mean, it's a beautiful thing. And I'm not talking 30-year-olds. I'm talking 80-year-olds. I have 75-year-olds, 80-year-olds, obviously the middle age group. But it's amazing that even the older population is able to get on board with this and learn from it. And, because it's techie. I mean, my mom doesn't do much tech, but, people were using my chart, it's becoming one of the things we got to do, especially after the COVID pandemic. But the CGM is amazing. I actually don't have diabetes, but I've worn a CGM too. And honestly, there's definitely this thing where you are less likely to reach for that super sweet item because you are petrified to see what will happen.
Yeah.
Okay. So I have tried it when I had the CGM on, and, to see the spike in the blood sugar, and how quickly it goes up, it's pretty, it freaks me out a little bit, and it's not, it's something that should be used. I feel, the wellness industry is really making a big push in this world. And, a lot of us are health and fitness and moving toward that direction. But I think this is not just for people with diabetes. I think it's definitely something for people who just want insight, to understand how their body works. And again, this idea, going back to this idea of you are an individual, we are all different. We all have different stressors. We have different metabolic issues, different genetic factors. So we are all different. And, the CGM can provide a lot of that insight and help kind of guide you too in terms of food choices and what works for you and what doesn't. So yeah, I'm very pro CGM, and I have a ton of patients on it. And just for those of you listening out there, Medicare is now being a little bit more lenient in terms of approving it, because it was a little bit more difficult. And post-COVID, now we're able to get it in a lot of the Medicare population a little bit. Obviously we still have a lot of paperwork we have to fill out, but there are a lot more people who are able to get it where it's covered. And I think that's great. And I think that they should continue to approve it and make it cheaper so that people have access to these things so they can make changes. I mean, the A1C reductions we've seen just by switching to a CGM have been phenomenal. It's not just about being on an insulin pump. It's the continuous glucose monitor, regardless, if you're not on insulin, if you're just on oral meds, can make a huge difference, because you'll change the way you eat when you look at what happens, your patterns, your spikes, etc.
Yeah, there's something magical about that biofeedback, just to be able to have the number and see it in real time. So let's talk a little bit about, we talked about sort of the diet, and I think you and I are definitely on the same page there. Not that we have to be, but, finding and doing what works for you. Exercise wise, and I'll just kind of start us out here. I have a few questions for you. One of the things that I have seen is that early on, I'm a big burly dude. I like working out with weights and, high intensity stuff. And early on, once again, being a little young and dumb, I took people right from couch potatoes right into some of this hardcore high intensity interval training, weight training and stuff like that. In my clinical experience, it backfired more times than not. And I found myself moving back to just getting people walking, looking at basically, how many steps are they taking a day? How often are they sitting? And getting them walking more. And of course, this independently sensitizes the body to insulin, because glucose raises the muscle has the ability to increase GLUT4 receptors the same way, the glucose receptors rather, the same way that insulin might, and it lowers cortisol. And so I love this sort of 1-2 punch. And of course, resistance training has its sort of merits, and cardiovascular training has its merits. This has been my approach, walking first, moving into weight training and cardiovascular stuff, if people love it, but it tends to throw their hunger and cravings off in a pretty sizable amount of my clinical experience. Where do you start? Do you see it similar to me? Do you do things differently? What kind of things can you teach us about your clinical experience, what you've noticed from someone who might be pre-diabetic to someone who's actually diabetic, and the way they handle exercise? What's your sort of insights that you can give us there?
So yeah, I agree in terms of you're not going to get them off the couch and running a marathon or doing something super intense, but I get them walking first, and then I add weights to the walk. So I'll tell them, hey, you're doing the walk, it's a slow walk, then you make it a brisk walk. And then why don't you just grab onto a couple of hand weights while you're walking? And then slowly, as they get more fit, or if they want to do more, then we start talking more about, strength training and cardio. But, that's the other thing, I think the pandemic has really changed in the sense, I feel that a lot more people have that ability because to do different exercise programs that are offered that help with all these different things. Like one particular program has access to, all those different things, right? So yoga's terrific. Then, cycling for a short period of time, and then doing weights. So there are so many different programs out there that can help people and guide them to getting fit at their level. And I often kind of defer to some of those programs in terms of exercise. And we also have an exercise program here where we work, where the patient can meet with our exercise physiologists who can also help them.
Just a couple interesting tidbits on some of the research around exercise. Walking, to me would be my number one. One of the interesting things about resistance training, though, I'm sure you know this, Dr. Kellis, but this is for the sort of listeners, is that when you lift weights, you are actually doing several different things. The muscles are an endocrine organ as well, so they secrete myokines, and these myokines actually seem to be primarily dealing with the liver and addressing some of the one of the things that happens in diabetes is the liver doesn't get the message to stop gluconeogenesis. Some of these myokines can help that signal sort of work better. And so one of the things that when we think about walking, we're thinking about the muscle being sort of this glucose sponge, but we're not always aware that when you lifting weights actually seems to release certain myokines that speak to the liver and work directly on the liver as well, which is really interesting that you chose weight training as well, walking and weight training. And then I love kind of what you said there. It's like, listen, there's lots and lots of different ways to do this and lots of different activities. And it'd be interesting to see, and we're not there yet, I think, in the science, clinically, it'd be interesting to see, which one of these things are having the best effect. My guess would be the thing that you can be consistent with and love and actually do. But I do think there are some interesting mechanisms that are different for different types of activity that will become more clear sort of in the years to come. So I don't know if you have anything more to add on that, but I think it's just a really interesting discussion in terms of, are there certain types of exercise we can do that can address certain aspects of blood sugar handling?
Well, that's the thing too. I think, you can't confuse what your goal is when you do the exercise, right? Well, obviously stress relief is one of them, but what is your goal? Like if your goal is weight loss, you have a different approach. But if your goal is, blood sugar reduction, you might emphasize more on also making sure you're building muscle and strength training, because it's when you're not exercising that muscle you just built is helping you and making you more insulin sensitive. So obviously weight loss helps you be more insulin sensitive, but it's still a little bit of both.
And what is the mechanism there to your understanding? My understanding is as those fat cells grow, one of the other things that fat cells, just like muscle cells, they're all endocrine organs. So the fat is secreting adipokines and different things that are impacting insulin sensitivity and ramping up inflammation and things like that. Is that the mechanism there, or is there something else going on?
Well, that, and also that, the more muscle you have, the more blood sugar is needed to get into those cells. So they're taken up by that, by the muscle itself. And you're more likely to get it into there quicker. Like that's why it's called insulin sensitivity, more insulin sensitive.
Yeah. And I love that, right? Because here you all are listening to a clinician, and essentially, if you read between the lines, it's essentially, even if you don't lose weight, just the fact that you are moving that muscle, it's acting as a glucose sink, absorbing all that, almost like a glucose sponge in a sense. And then what Dr. Kellis is saying too, is if you can grow some muscle, which isn't necessarily imperative, but if you can, that has some extra benefit than when you go move that extra muscle, or even when you're sitting still. So let's get into a little bit now about sort of the natural supplements and what your favorites are. I have one that's my favorite that you haven't mentioned yet, and I want to see if perhaps you don't like this for some reason I'm not aware of. And this is why I love talking to clinicians, because you get to, together with different clinicians, say, oh, I didn't know that. But my favorite is berberine. I think it functions a whole lot like metformin. So I oftentimes will start, for people who don't like metformin, I'll oftentimes go berberine. And then of course, all the vitamin type of things, magnesium and the B vitamins and that kind of stuff. And then I kind of ramp up from there, but that's sort of always been my sort of first line. I've had good success with that, berberine and, sort of the vitamins and minerals, chromium, all that kind of stuff. What are your favorites and your go-tos, and what have you seen be clinically most effective?
So, I actually haven't. I had maybe one patient on berberine. The ones that many of my patients have used, the like cinnamon has been a big, I know probably several years ago, cinnamon must have been like hot on the press because there was a slew of people constantly coming in on cinnamon tablets.
Yeah, and not so much anymore.
Yeah, not so much anymore. But I always used to say, hey, you don't necessarily need to take that whole tablet. You could just add cinnamon, I mean, obviously it's the amount too, but like, just put it on, your breakfast or whatever. But chromium's a big one, and this sugar break product, has a bunch of different different leaves in there. There are 3 different products they have. The one product, actually Stabilize, is used for postprandial blood sugar. So that has the white mulberry leaf extract, the banaba leaf, and the chromium in it together. So it sort of works symbiotically to reduce postprandial blood sugar. So
and fenugreek too, yeah? Is that
the fenugreek is in the reduce line. So and reduce is sort of the one you take, once a day to help keep the blood sugars even during the day. So it's fenugreek and banaba leaf, and also has the gymnema in it. So these all block, they block carbs, and the banaba leaf actually also has polyphenols in it, which are antioxidants. So there are various different positive effects that can be seen with that. So it can help reduce the blood sugar, and even have some positive effects in cholesterol. And some of the people who have been on these products, again, the other thing is having that CGM on board. You can see, when you take the product, the blood sugar reduction versus, not having it on board was shown up to like 42% in the Stabilized product. So yeah, I mean, that in people in the beginning, before they're adding on metformin, or if they're hesitant to add on metformin, it's nice to have other options. But when those options are exhausted and you've done the exercise, you've done the lifestyle, and things aren't getting better, then you do need to move on. I mean, you need to move on. And there are plenty of drugs out there, as we discussed earlier in the program, that just do phenomenal jobs in reducing blood sugar and getting you to where you need to be. And now we have plenty of other options that can actually help with weight loss. Because for so many years, the products we had for diabetes, the sulfonylureas, for example, that class was making people gain weight. And like most diabetics have obesity. So we finally have things that can help to, reduce weight, which is one of the most important things we need to do in people who have diabetes, who are obese.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Some of the products that you recommended, it's really interesting, your clinical approach, right? Because you're kind of taking this approach where it's like some of this would be like stopping the sweet taste in the mouth, so you don't eat as much. Some of the products that you're talking about here are decreasing the amount of sugar that we might absorb. Others are actually dealing with the underlying biochemistry of what's going on inside the body, which is a really interesting sort of clinical way to do that. I'm just pointing that out for everybody. Kind of the way that you're looking at this, it's really useful. And I also do love, sort of that you bring up some of the diabetes drugs. For example, some of the drugs you mentioned, right? One of the reasons they were working, they were increasing the ability for the body to clear glucose by increasing adipocytes and making it so these people are getting fatter. Their blood sugars might be under control, but that's not necessarily the approach that we want. And now we have sort of new treatment. So let's round this out now with this, going back to kind of how we started this discussion. So it sounds like, from listening to you clinically, metformin is sort of your beginning place to start, or are you, how are you managing that? Is it metformin, seeing if that can get things under control, and then adding things on? And one thing I do want to say here, Dr. Kellis, because I think it's important, and jump in here and comment on this if you want to. One of the things that I've seen happen lately, especially since the pandemic, is that a lot of people who are, sort of health advocates like you and I, and pay very close attention to this, there does seem to be this belief that natural medicine and diet and exercise always solve the problem, or always curative. And of course, I certainly thought that for a long time in my early days, until you see enough clients that you go, they are doing everything right. And it's not curative, and it's not making a difference. And you cannot have these people walking around with blood sugars this high and expecting to have any quality of life or live a long life. And so it is true from my clinical perspective that sometimes the diet and the exercise doesn't work, even when people seem to be doing it. And we do have to have this next level here. And so any thoughts on that? And I would just love to, just learn from your clinical experience about how you're thinking about these drugs, and also anyone who's not a clinician or coach, understanding how they can talk to their physicians about the different classes of drugs, the new ones, and which ones we should be thinking about or asking about.
Yeah. So basically, it's the metformin usually is that first go-to once you're like on treatment. And I will say, like, yes, natural can help to a certain degree, but then, some people get upset and they get frustrated with themselves and they feel like they failed, even though they're doing everything right. And the lifestyle, the exercise, but, at the end of the day, as I said earlier, genes play a role, age plays a role, insulin resistance continues, and you shouldn't be blaming yourself for like moving to pre-diabetes or diabetes because you've done everything right. But, once you've sort of used the supplement, use the, lifestyle and exercise, metformin is typically my first. And then I start looking at the risk factors. So if a patient has had a history of heart attacks or stroke, then you want to consider the SGLT2 inhibitors because of their really great data on cardiovascular risk reduction.
And what are the common names of those, just so people know?
So Farxiga, Jardiance, Invokana, those would be, I know pharma's out there like with commercials and stuff, so I'm sure maybe that's how they would be hearing them. And then also the GLP-1s, the liraglutide, which is Victoza, has also been shown to reduce cardiovascular risk, and they're weekly GLP-1s as well, Ozempic, Trulicity, to name a few. And it also comes in oral form. So those are great add-ons for weight loss and that potential for cardiovascular risk reduction. So the weight loss is pretty significant in that group, in the GLP-1s. And now there are studies out there looking at GLP-1 with GIP. So that is another medication that'll be up and running that'll help together to improve blood sugar as well as contribute to the weight loss and the A1C reduction.
And part of the reason that they're contributing to the weight loss, my understanding is, for those who don't understand these incretins, they're basically hunger hormones.
Yeah. So they satiate, you feel full. And it's funny because sometimes you do tell the patient when you start them on it, but sometimes you're like, I just feel full. Like, am I supposed to be feeling full? I'm like, yeah, that's one of the things that it does for you. It sends a signal to your brain, makes you feel full, so you eat less. And
then a lot of what the benefit would be driven is that the drug, then calories are reduced, insulin levels go down, insulin resistance starts to reverse, all this stuff starts to be sort of moving backwards. And so I love that you're bringing this up because we do have new and better and more appropriate drugs now for this condition. One of the things I want to ask, final thing I want to ask and see, I know you have something to add, so add it, but then what about insulin, and when are we putting people on insulin?
The one thing I did want to say was that, because some of these newer drugs have the cardiovascular risk and the weight loss reduction and all these really great things, which is why I do end up adding these drugs onto the regimen when needed. Again, back to the patient, a lot of people, especially as they age and they're in that Medicare population, these drugs can be very, very costly. So you have to look at, can they afford it? I mean, if it's in the hundreds of dollars and thousands of dollars, obviously, it's going to limit their ability to A, buy it, and B, take it. So that's when you start to consider, other options that might be, a little bit more cost effective, but not necessarily the most optimal choice. And that's a conversation you obviously need to have with your physician.
And one thing I'll add there, clinically speaking, I mean, I don't know about you, but I can kind of tell that this is how you do it. It's kind of how I've always done it. like if someone if someone has high blood pressure, let's say, that's a risk factor. So you want to lower that blood pressure with drugs, and then you start working on the life. It doesn't mean that you're not still working on the lifestyle stuff. And many people, not everyone, I wouldn't even say most, but many people do master those lifestyle habits over time, and they can be taken off of these drugs. Not most, but many. And so I think any clinician is still working on that lifestyle stuff while reducing the immediate risk.
Yeah, I think it's really important to let the patient know, because sometimes they do feel like it's a life sentence when getting into your question about insulin. Mm-hmm. Oh my God, what are you doing? Mm-hmm. What do you mean you're starting me on insulin? Like it's this life sentence. But sometimes, for example, if a patient with type 2 diabetes presents in the hospital, their body is loaded with glucose, freaking out, and no oral drug is going to touch them. They need insulin to make the body happy and cool it down and, get it working again. And so, you can explain there's certain patients who can have that insulin initially, and then we can add on those orals and transition them off the insulin. It doesn't necessarily mean everyone's going to be off of it. Obviously, if you have type 1, you're going to be on insulin. But if you have type 2 diabetes, in some situations, when you start insulin, you're not necessarily committed to it if it's in a situation like I described before. So, that is one of the things that you need to make clear.
I love this hierarchy you presented to us clinically. I mean, it really is a beautiful sort of way to look at it, right? It's sort of like, listen, depending on where you are and the type of patient you are, we're always going to be working on diet and exercise type of stuff. And then we're going to look at natural stuff. That's sort of like the next step up, and we're moving into low force pharmaceuticals and stuff like that. And then we're potentially moving into higher force pharmaceuticals based on the individual. And that should, in my mind, always be the way it is. It's just good medicine, but we can't always just take someone from a very sick, type 2 diabetic who has, all this blood sugar. Sometimes we have to get them on insulin, lower that, make the changes. And yes, some people, I've seen it, I'm sure you've seen it, some people will do make it all the way back. Many end up in some phase along the way, and it's necessary. I'm so grateful for your educating us here. I want to make sure that we talk a little bit more about anything else you want to cover. And I do want to make sure people are aware of, because you mentioned Sugar Break. You're on the medical board with Sugar Break. Is that correct?
Yes.
And so with these sort of natural products, and I think it's an interesting company because it is a group of primarily MDs, from what I can see, who are working very closely with thousands and thousands and thousands of patients dealing with blood sugar issues and diabetes, and coming up with research-based, evidence-based natural products that can make a big difference, and they're using these in the clinic. So any other thing you want to add, or anything you want to talk about with the Sugar Break products or anything like that, I would love to.
So that's the one thing, there's so many drugs out there in pharma for type 2 diabetes, and it's so nice to have a product that is, looking at the science and trying to get information that is science-based. And as you can see, a lot of the supplements that are in Stabilize, Reduce, and Resist have been studied in the past, and many of those studies are, coming more and more. Like in the last, several years or so, they're doing more clinical studies looking at this to see the efficacy and the help that it does in reducing blood sugar. So it's nice being part of a team that, is a natural product that really finally has the approach of looking at a science-based way to bring natural product to the public to help them reach their blood sugar goals.
Yeah, love it. I'm going to do a real quick summation, and you could test me on it and to make sure that the takeaways are there for people. But here's what I've heard you talk about today. Essentially, when we're talking about blood sugar management and treatments and reducing, the propensity to get to diabetes, we're talking about, first and foremost, making sure you're watching your carbohydrate intake. You mentioned clearly, whether you're diabetic or not, this is one of the things that all of us should be doing. And one of the things that you mentioned there that we talked about is this idea that measuring this, if possible, if you can get a CGM or continuous glucose monitor. Yes, lower carbohydrates, but also have a way to monitor certain foods that you might not be aware are causing difficulty in your blood sugars. Then understanding the importance of exercise, and Dr. sort of educate us on the idea of, walking and weight training, but finding something you love and being able to do that, becoming movers rather than sitters. And then, of course, we have the natural medicine sort of options there. Certainly, you have certain products. There are products available, and then the idea of these different types of drugs, especially new and better ones that actually reduce risk and control blood sugar. And this is sort of, in my mind, the full sort of spectrum. You start with diet and lifestyle. You definitely can use natural medicines, and then being aware of all sort of the drug-based options. And one thing you said critically, and I think you modeled this really well, is finding a clinician, a physician who is willing to work with you as an individual and understand you as an individual and work with you on these different sort of patterns, rather than doing just simple cookie cutter medicine. And by the way, everyone listening to this happens whether in conventional medicine or alternative and complementary medicine. Now, you have a lot of cookie cutter sort of practices. And I would say a clinician who can understand your unique risks, your physiology, your psychology, your preferences, your practical circumstances, and design a plan around that is going to be the best bet.
Awesome.
So sounds good to you? That sums it up. Did I miss anything there?
It was perfect.
Perfect. Dr. Kellis, I'm so grateful for you coming on, educating us. I always love just catching up with another clinician and learning from you. Thank you so much for your time and for your education and the work that you're doing. We appreciate you very much.
Thank you so much for having me. This was wonderful.